Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Scott, and thank you to the American Founding Initiative for sponsoring this talk. So my first real encounter with Julius Caesar was in Latin class in my sophomore year of high school. There's a way of teaching Latin now where you basically get through as much of the language as possible so that you can get to real Latin texts and then treat them like a math problem and decode them. And, every grammatical construction, morphology, and syntax, they have to be explained. This is actually not a good way to learn Latin, I discovered later. If you actually have a goal of being able to read and use the language as such. But that's what we did. And, even though I eventually came to enjoy this method and get decent enough at it to get through a classics PhD, at the time, I was terrible at it because one of my principles in life at that time was never do any work outside of class under any circumstances. It was also a terrible way to learn Latin. So I had a tough time with Caesar's Gallic War commentaries, but they are a really good subject matter for that method because they're so clean and logical. They really kind of exemplify that quality of the Latin language. And even then, I came to appreciate Caesar. Gallia est omnis divisa and partes tres. Gaul is as a whole divided into three parts, and it's just ringing in my head ever since my high school years. And even then, after spending just a week or two on one paragraph, I came to appreciate, I think, that there was not a single word misplaced in Caesar's Gallic War commentaries. There's not anything on the page that's unnecessary. There's no waste at all. There's perfect efficiency. And I think that this is a window onto the mind of the man himself. It's a faithful image of his soul, as Plutarch would say. It's the same mind that you see at work in this great episode in his early career. So Caesar spent his first term as a provincial governor after his praetorship in Spain, and he had some not insubstantial military successes, and he managed to get his friends in Rome to convince the Senate to vote him the right to have a triumph at the Eternal City. And a triumphal procession in commemoration of a military victory is the most glorious thing a Roman statesman can ever hope to achieve. Many consuls never triumphed, and they wish that they had. And here Caesar was about to have a triumph as having only been a praetor, the second highest office at Rome. It would pole vault his career in Rome, guarantee a successful career. He was 39 at the time. But then Caesar's enemies stepped in. In particular, one man who was already shaping up to be his nemesis in politics, Cato, who's already kind of an adversary of Caesar. They had clashed over the fate of the Catilinarian conspirators a few years earlier. Cato advocating for the death penalty, Caesar advocating for life in prison, a very un-Roman punishment. And Cato won that argument. They clashed again during Caesar's praetorship. There's many instances already in this point in Caesar's career. Cato's sounding the alarm even then. Caesar's a tyrant on the rise, and he's aiming to overthrow the Republic, which I think was a bit hot under the collar at the time, but maybe it was prophetic. But Cato saw with this whole triumph thing that there was a catch in Caesar's plans, and that was Caesar also wanted to run for the consulship that summer for the following year. And in order to celebrate a triumph, you have to wait outside the city limits, because when you enter the city limits, you also lay down your official command, your imperium in Roman law, and to celebrate a triumph requires holding that imperium. And you actually lay it down formally once you enter the city limits in the actual triumphal procession of a triumph. So again, Caesar wants to run for consul for the upcoming year to apply for his candidacy. And to apply for his candidacy, for any candidacy, you have to go and fill out the paperwork in the official office, which is inside the city limits. So if he applies for consul, according to the usual practice, he's going to lose the right to a triumph, because in fact the deadline for applying for consular candidacy is fast approaching, whereas it's going to take many more weeks, maybe even months, for the triumphal procession to get organized, for a date to get approved by the Senate, and so on. So normally, he'd have to choose either being a consul as soon as he possibly can the next upcoming year, dispensing with the triumph, or doing the more probably expected Roman thing of just having the triumph and waiting a year for his opportunity to come again for the consulship. But Caesar, he's so hasty, he manages to wrangle the votes in the Senate to actually get himself voted an exception to run for consul in absentia, or to make his candidacy application in absentia through an agent or something, as he's just right outside the city walls. And the Senate's willing, he's got the votes. The vote's going to go through if they can manage to hold it. But up steps Cato and blocks him with one of his legendary filibuster campaigns, day after day, winding down the clock until the sun sets and the official Senate meeting has to end. No business can be transacted at night. So he's trying to prevent the vote from being held, and he succeeds. He wants to force Caesar to wait a year for his consulship and do the thing that everybody expects him to do, which is to have the triumph and just wait. But Caesar never wanted to waste a word, never wanted to waste a minute, much less a year, and he has bigger plans. So while Cato is railing thereon on the last day about this and that until the sun goes down, Caesar just enters the city on the last possible day. He dispenses with the triumph. He gives it up. Really unheard of. Shocks the establishment. He puts his name down that very day for the consular elections upcoming, which of course he wins his slot for. So Caesar's always eager to get to the next step and never waste a minute. And over the course of his 55 short years, Caesar made a stunning impact on the Roman world. No single Roman politician, I think it's fair to say, besides maybe Constantine, changed the course of Roman history as much as Caesar did. The conquest of Gaul, civil wars, the shift from a republic to an empire. Even among his detractors, it's hard to find anyone that's willing to say that he's overrated. When it comes to the question, at least, of his sheer forcefulness or his unquestionable skill in statesmanship. He was beloved by so many. He spared the lives of so many of his enemies. He was one of Rome's all-time most skilled legislators, and he's a champion of the lower and the middle classes, and he's beloved by so many people. But he's also at least partly responsible for the slaughter of tens of thousands of his own countrymen. In the great civil war he fought with Pompey and the Optimates of the Senate, he's entirely responsible before that for the deaths of up to 1 million Gauls in the great conquest of that territory from 58 to 52 BC. And later, of course, there's the issue of him being accused of being a tyrant and then getting murdered by some disgruntled senators who claimed he was destroying the Republican Constitution. So it's always been a little challenging for polite people to embrace Caesar without reserve, and all the more so for Christians. And I think the question of what Christians are supposed to do with Caesar is a pressing one because it fits into this larger philosophical or even theological discussion that Scott alluded to about what Christians are supposed to do with men of power, if you will. And I get asked a version of this question very often, seeing as I run a podcast dedicated to cataloging and sometimes, I admit, celebrating such pagan men of power from antiquity. It's a difficult issue I wrestle with a lot, and so consider this part of a work in progress. I'll be interested in your feedback, and there's other directions I could have taken this presentation. So interested in your thoughts. Now, the easy answer is the negative one to this question of what do we do with a guy like Caesar? And I think in the West, we've allowed this answer to dominate since World War II, at least. Caesar bad, basically. The Caesar bad framework. Under the post-war consensus, Caesar is variously seen through the lens of Benito Mussolini, of Hitler himself, or better yet, Emperor Palpatine. This is the kind of the Dan Carlin take. And, Dan Carlin's account of the Gallic War campaigns is called Celtic Holocaust. So you can get a sense of where he stands there. When we think of Caesar, educated people are supposed to shake their heads and quote that famous facile dictum, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And all the more the case holds for Christians. I mean, how can you call yourself a Christian, admiring Julius Caesar? Do you know how many decent Roman matrons that devil seduced? And this negative answer also, it runs deep in the Anglo-American tradition. And I'd argue Shakespeare himself basically takes this line in the play, Julius Caesar, where Caesar at times appears to be a kind of doddering old man, rendered a little soft by his lack of serious challengers. Americans from George Washington onward were expected to see themselves more in the party of Cato and Cicero rather than the party of Caesar. You can acknowledge Caesar's personal virtue maybe, like Shakespeare kind of does, or Washington's favorite play, Cato by Joseph Addison, perhaps does at moments. But you're supposed to always remember that the Republicans are on the right side of history, even and maybe especially when they lose. And this made sense in the early revolutionary days of our country, throwing off the yoke of a tyrant and so on. But we tend to forget that George Washington, earlier in his career, studied Caesar's commentaries with great gusto and even ordered a bust of the man from England. Conveniently for Washington, these busts were on back order at the time, and so it was never delivered, and conveniently not to be found in his house when he was, the commander of the Continental Army and later the Republic's first president. Would have been a bad look. And we also tend to ignore Hamilton's comment to Jefferson that, quote, Julius Caesar was the greatest man that ever lived. It's important that was to Jefferson, right? He's trolling him a little bit, but I think he kind of believed it. So there are, however, some positive approaches to Julius Caesar offered by Christians throughout history. And I see three main ones. The first is the unknowing instrument of divine providence model. A man like Caesar, whether he's good or evil in himself, is in some sense a good thing, or at least it's good that he happened because God used him to launch his master plan. For example, St. Paul was born a Roman citizen. Why? Well, in fact, it was because in the Civil War, Tarsus, Paul's hometown, was one of the very few major cities of the East to side with Caesar against Pompey. And after his victory, Caesar personally visited the city and rewarded it by granting hereditary citizenship to all the adult males. And so Paul's grandfather or great-grandfather, who knows, was made a citizen by Caesar himself. And for this reason, Paul found his way to Rome to make his appeal to the imperial authorities there, as we hear in Acts 27. It's often observed that the gospel was able to spread more effectively because of the political and relative linguistic unity of the Roman Empire in the mid-1st century AD. That these lands were all part of one single empire and not, say, many independent kingdoms and Roman successor states, has a great deal to do with the deliberate policies and civil war victory of Caesar himself. The Pax Romana is not just a byproduct of the transition to an imperial monarchy, but was itself the end envisioned by its architect, who is Julius Caesar, as I'll discuss shortly. This unknowing instrument of divine providence model is one possible interpretation of the New Testament's idea that, of the fullness of time, of the kairos, of the coming of Christ, e.g. Galatians 4, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, and so on. So Julius Caesar could then be part of God's master plan, perhaps. But even if that's so, it doesn't necessarily make Caesar himself worth admiring or emulating, because he could be like so many other instruments of providence who appear in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, such as Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, whom God sent to chastise the Jews with righteous justice, but these instruments were still basically bad. As the prophet Jeremiah puts it, "This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste." End quote. Thus the husbandman casts away the worn-out tool he's done using into the fire. Now, a second perspective is offered by St. Augustine. I like to say Augustine these days because that's actually closer to the Latin, and Augustine is a kind of British affectation from the earliest 20th century, but I don't know. We'll say Augustine. So Augustine accepts the first idea that the Roman Empire was indeed an instrument of providence, but he also acknowledges that the Romans won their empire through a certain kind of virtue and even deserved the rule that they won. They have their reward, so to speak. This is a quote from City of God, Book 5. "To suppress the grievous evils of many nations, God entrusted this dominion to those men, the Romans, in preference to all others who serve their country for the sake of honor, praise, and glory, who look to find that glory in their country's safety above their own, and who suppressed greed for money and many other faults." But Augustine adds that the Romans did so in favor of that one fault of theirs, the love of praise. So Caesar might be said to exemplify that quintessential Roman quality of love of honor and glory. And Augustine likes this because it's a lesser vice, or it's at least a virtue that pushes out other vices like the love of money and lust and so forth. And he observes that the Romans constructed their entire republican constitution and culture around it. And they stoked the youth, that quality, and the men of high ability, and then those men subsumed their desires and their thirst for honor to the good of the commonwealth. It actually served the interest of the state for them to be like that. But for Augustine, this model of action falls short of being genuinely praiseworthy, because the best thing, after all, is to seek and serve the glory of the one true God. And we have to remember that he's arguing against the pagans in City of God, and so he can't afford to give the heroes of the Roman Republic their full due, because his opponents claim them as their supreme heroes. And so Augustine's proposal is that those supposed supreme examples of Roman virtue, like Cincinnatus, the ancient Brutus, Camillus, and so on, they're mainly useful to Christians to shame ourselves into action and to prevent us from feeling pride for our own accomplishments. If the original Brutus was willing to execute his sons for conspiring against the Republic for the sake of the earthly city, the city of man, well then how can aspiring denizens of the city of God, for example, fail to include the poor among our own sons by bequeathing them a portion of our own wealth and inheritance? For sharing your legacy with the poor is much easier to do than killing your children. And then how can you, a Christian, take pride in the praise you may win if you do the easier thing when the Roman did the harder thing for a lesser reward, for mere honor, and so on? A side note here, all due respect to a great man and a great thinker and a saint like Augustine, but I think that his anxiety about the love of praise is a little excessive and even simplistic. It has to do a lot, I think, with his own rejection of his profession as a public orator. At the very least, if the men who founded this country had shared that same anxiety to the degree that Augustine did, I don't think that they would have founded the country. I would propose instead that honor is the real currency of politics. It's not absolute, it's not the highest thing, but it is a legitimate incentive, and it makes as much sense for Christians to say honor doesn't matter as it does to say money doesn't matter. That's fine, but then such statements remove you entirely from the political or economic equation. The correct thing to say is that these things matter, it's just other things matter more. Okay, so to return to the Augustinian model, which we can call the shame the Christians to be better by comparison with the inferior model, at least it's capable of acknowledging some virtue in an example of a great person like Caesar, who gave everything he had and more, after all, to his earthly city. But I think it fails to inspire us to make a deep personal encounter with the man himself, a personal relationship. Sorry, I'm from Houston, so. This won't allow us to see ourselves in him. And that, according to Plutarch, is where real personal transformation can happen. For Plutarch would have us use history as a mirror, to stare so intently at the examples of great figures that we may even come to love them. And through that process of love, see their flaws, and accordingly our own. Anyone with a spouse or children knows that real lasting love does not blind you to the faults of another person, but helps you to understand and explain those faults in terms of a deeper structure of character, much of which may indeed be changeable, but usually only with great difficulty and often only by the grace of God. There's a third option, though, that I'm especially interested in, and that's well grounded in Christendom. And we can call it the Nine Worthies model. This pattern first appears in those exact terms in the late medieval period. The Nine Worthies were 9 men held up as examples of the chivalric ideal. There were 3 Christians. I know David has some opinions on this. There were 3 Christians in these Nine Worthies. The 3 Christians are King Arthur, Charlemagne, and Godfrey of Bouillon. I had to look down to make sure I got that right. He's the leader of the First Crusade. This is not my field, but he sounds awesome. But then there's 3 Jews from the Old Testament. There's Joshua, King David, and Judah Maccabee. And then there are 3 pagans, Hector, Alexander the Great, and who else? Julius Caesar. And so this starts to happen in the 4th century, where you get these Nine Worthies codified. There are literary discussions of this. You can also go check out the statuary group at the City Hall of Cologne, which dates from the 1300s. And these were men that Christian knights and princes of Europe were supposed to measure themselves against. They weren't saints, and they weren't even perfect as rulers and statesmen. King Arthur's weaknesses led him to being cuckolded by Guinevere and Lancelot. David fell for Bathsheba. Then he had her husband Uriah killed in battle, of course, and so on. But nonetheless, they were models to match for anyone aspiring to leadership. Cervantes portrays Don Quixote as claiming that he outdid all of the Nine Worthies all together and individually. It's funny, but it only reinforces the fact that these Nine Worthies upheld a standard of excellence in rulership and conduct for anyone aspiring to serious secular authority. Christ tells the Pharisees that he expects his followers to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. And this side of glory, we will always have Caesars, authorities charged with keeping external foes and internal wickedness at bay. And we should want and demand that they be the best possible versions of themselves. To do this, they have to be good at their job. And for this, the original Caesar can help. Now, I call this the Nine Worthies framework, but it's basically one Christian version of what is essentially the attitude of Plutarch to great figures of the past. Study them carefully, emulate their virtues, learn from their vices and mistakes. And if you don't know who Plutarch is, I have a good podcast that you should listen to. But he was very popular among many Christian thinkers, writers, readers throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, of course. So why was Julius Caesar one of the Nine Worthies? Or better yet, why could he be one again for us in our day? So more on Caesar now at last. Well, contrast Caesar with a figure now viewed as less problematic, Marcus Aurelius. Undoubtedly, Marcus was a good man, a good emperor, except arguably for the whole persecuting Christians part. Marcus Aurelius was picked for his role, however, by Hadrian as a young man. He was inserted into the top seat of an established imperial system, and of course managed it well, but he was spared the struggle even of infiltrating it through any dogged personal agency, much less of establishing it in the first place. Caesar, however, began his career on the losing side of the First Great Roman Civil War. In Caesar's teenage years, Sulla vanquished his own enemies in a bloody conflict, many of them Caesar's family members and family connections. Marius was Caesar's uncle-in-law. Is that right? Yeah, married his aunt. So Sulla established himself as a dictator after that, and he built a new republican oligarchy packed with his own conservative establishment supporters, the Optimates as they were called, and he charged them with the care of a somewhat tweaked throwback republican constitution. And Caesar, from his very youth, set himself against this post-Sulla oligarchy and establishment, which many analysts, ancient and modern, consider to be a corrupt, kleptocratic crony regime, unable to manage the affairs of a vast sprawl of new and newish imperial provinces, unable to restrain the rapacity of governors or brutally exploitative Roman business interests, a tight-knit group, a regime of great old families generally hostile to the encroachments into high office from anyone outside their clique. To rise up and challenge this establishment was tremendously difficult. But Caesar pulled it off with great flair, and legally too, for the most part. If he bent the Constitution at times, he nonetheless made his rise first by mastering its traditions and norms, winning offices, priesthoods, doing quality expert politicking, building massive support both from the populace and from many elites. And of course, he also did it through military achievements. In other words, he worked his novel magic in the fashion of a Roman of the old stamp. Caesar truly was a patriot and a great disruptor in an age of political stagnation, corruption, complacency. It was likely Caesar's military campaigns above all that impressed the medievals, though. And his success in conquering the proud people of Gaul so swiftly and with such finality was a virtuosic display not only of rare personal courage and expert generalship, but of diplomatic brilliance, political wisdom, cultural sensitivity, raw, energetic determination. And he worked out his win on the Roman principle that's idealized by Virgil in the Aeneid, parcere subjectis et debellare superbos. How did I translate this? Spare the submissive, war down the proud. And this took 7 years in the 50s to war down and pacify this extremely complex and resilient patchwork of rival tribes and tribal superstate confederations. Now, one advantage of the Nine Worthies framework, or the Plutarchan framework, of admiration and emulation, is that we can debate about the relative merits of great figures without requiring ourselves to either declare them saints or dismiss them as not ours simply because we object to some of their decisions or if we identify some of their vices. For example, we can debate the justice or not of Caesar's conquest of Gaul. I think the criticisms are probably obvious. We've hinted at them already, the criticisms of his Gallic campaigns. No question it was basically an aggressive war of imperial domination. But in the war's favor, it's worth pointing out that in living memory, the Gauls had assembled massive armies, slain tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of Roman soldiers, together with many Roman consuls serving as generals, threatened Italy itself. They actually crossed the Alps and were in northern Italy on a collision course with Rome. Gaius Marius and friends stopped them. So this was just in the last decade of the previous century, in living memory. Gaul was not some peaceable, unsuspecting utopia of farmers and traders, but a fierce, warlike, and huge region constantly at war with itself, with waves of its intrigues and flare-ups continually lapping at the very borders of Italy. So this really was a security issue. And moreover, this was an imperial expansion that proved brilliantly sustainable for the empire. So unlike Germany or, say, Mesopotamia, Gaul's right there. It's on the border of Italy, and it has a natural external border of its own on the Rhine. And once conquered, it remained an ever more integral part of the Roman world for more than 5 centuries. Its internal wars ceased, except for the occasional usurper. That's a different story. And it became a cultural and economic powerhouse, following a pattern of slow and steady assimilation and enfranchisement, making the people of citizens. And this was along the pattern laid down by Caesar himself. Caesar's career also, more than that perhaps of any other single man in pagan antiquity, demonstrates the power of logos as the ordering principle of the universe. His Gallic war commentaries, they're one of the great literary monuments of classical antiquity. And even making allowance for the fact that they are, let's face it, wartime propaganda, they are nevertheless a remarkable testament to the man's truthfulness, I think. His serene mastery of counsel and persuasion, and his style and wit. Caesar's success was built even more on force of persuasion than on force of arms. He kept up a lively literary correspondence with the most important tastemakers and opinion setters in Rome. He was reading the latest poetry and philosophy, debating the finer points of good style and proper education, as Cicero's correspondence attests. There's a great story, if you've ever read Catullus, the Roman poet from around this time. Catullus wrote this insulting poem about Caesar, and then Caesar visited the poet's dad in northern Italy, because he knew his dad, of course, and basically the dad invited the son to dinner, and Catullus, the poet, was very contrite and never said a bad word about Caesar again. So he keeps tabs on the whole scene. It's remarkable. So as for the civil war, however, which Caesar waged with Pompey, once again, healthy debates in order. His crossing of the Rubicon, and the results that followed, you might argue it was a bit disproportionate. But I think there can be no question that his duplicitous and intransigent opponents in the Roman Senate, Pompey and especially Cato, and a bunch of warhawk friends, that they were acting with no more real concern for the rule of law than Caesar was, nor with any less consideration of their personal interests in a factional conflict. Caesar was defending his dignitas, his honor, his constitutional right to claim the prizes merited by his achievements on behalf of the Republic, the least of which was surely the right to survive politically and have another fair shot at office at some point in the future. But even this they were not willing to grant him. In all reasonable likelihood, he faced exile or worse if he did not take up arms to defend his honor. After the war began, he continually sued for peace on, I think, genuinely fair terms. He was consistently turned down, up until the great slaughter in the fields of Pharsalus, when he, like a great brush fire, swept away so much of the aging growth of the Roman elite, much good along with the bad. But he had every justification to ruefully pronounce, on the day of his sad victory, that it was they who chose this, not me. Caesar was famously merciful to his enemies, however, as we all know, pardoning far more men than he perhaps should have, often much to the resentment of his own loyal followers. Some of the men he pardoned, of course, were the principal conspirators. But Caesar wanted to be the leader of free men and not of cowed and terrified subjects. And so this was a price he was willing to pay. As we turn to the subject of Caesar's vision for Rome, however, after his victory, and the transition from republic to empire, I think it's here, above all, that we have to keep in mind that Rome's challenges were not our own, and we should not expect a statesman, even one we admire very much, to propose modern American solutions or even early Roman solutions to the problems of the late Roman Republic. On the one hand, having reviewed the evidence, such as I have, I think it is true that Caesar did not set out to topple the Roman Republican constitution and set himself up as a monarch. His career at all points up to the Civil War fits into the framework of a classic Roman populist like the Gracchi brothers or Marius, men who merely wished to claim a victory in the traditional Republican game of honors by offering benefits to and thereby leveraging the power of a far greater swath of society than the Roman aristocracy traditionally catered to. From the days of the secession of the plebs and the founding of the office of the tribunes in the 5th century BC, the Roman state had thrived on a dynamic, even violent at times, tension, a continual clashing between the interests of the rich and the poor, the noble and the base, and their respective champions. And Caesar was just playing that game up until a point. However, by the time that Caesar won the Civil War, I think he realized, apparently he realized this, that the game had changed. Perhaps it had broken in the process of him winning it so decisively. Or perhaps it was already broken by the time he got there, broken by the consolidation of power and wealth by a narrow elite, passing on the hereditary privileges of political network, vast clientele, foreign and domestic, priestly rank, and so on. As a man from an old family and an inheritor of some of those privileges, Caesar understood how profoundly the game was rigged. Largely through bribes and favors, and it was rigged against all outsiders. And I think this fact probably explains, in part, his immense lifelong respect for his oftentimes opponent, Cicero, one such outsider who, against all odds, with incredible talent and quite a bit of luck, managed to become a new man and win the consulship. So the elite's focus in Caesar's day on monopolizing offices, honors, generalships, and the wealth and political power attendant on such things tended to narrow their focus away from the needs of the denizens of the vast territory that depended on Rome. Rome's citizen ranks after the social war of Caesar's teenage years now counted all the free men native to Italy, and many individuals and communities spread across the Mediterranean. That was now formally the populace, the P in SPQR. And Caesar had added to the ranks of these citizens himself. He rewarded men who fought in Rome's wars, his wars, contributed substantially to his victories, especially the northern Italian populations. And he'd also spread communities of existing citizens, both the urban poor of Rome and his retired veteran soldiers, all across key places under the imperial sway. So I mean, there's citizens all over the empire. This is long before the Edict of Caracalla. But I mean, the Roman citizenry is just incomparably more massive in Caesar's day than it was in the days even of the Gracchi. So could the mandatorily in-person citizen voting assemblies of Rome, in the city of Rome, an electorate, when you describe it that way, which for sheer practicality could only ever perhaps number in the low tens of thousands, could that electorate really claim to be anything more than a symbolic rehearsal of the revered voice of the people? Could a provincial administration, staffed by 1 or 2 year termers, arriving from and quickly hurrying back to Rome, constantly thinking of leveraging their time served and plunder acquired in the provinces into political capital for honors in the game at the mother city, could such a system ever credibly administer justice consistently to the provincials, or claim to be anything more than an extractive regime of masters lording it over their slaves, however free such slaves might be in name? Although some of his ardent admirers in modern times have tried to deny this, I think it's clear that upon his final return from the civil wars, Caesar had landed on monarchy, or a form of it, as the solution. He had built up and been running a huge military, legislative, administrative, propagandistic machine for nearly 15 years that was answerable to him only, without reference to Republican norms. And experience showed it worked much, much better. You sort of start to think of somebody running a gigantic company and wondering, why does politics suck? It doesn't have to be like this. So he also had seen the way that Hellenistic dynasts of the East organized ethnically and geographically sprawling kingdoms filled with subjects loyal not to a city, not to a constitution, but to a ruler, and better put, the divine charisma of a ruler, certified by ruler cult typically. So, these Hellenistic monarchies are certainly not models to be copied wholesale, but surely there were lessons to be learned. And a Roman version of this could gradually be worked out. I think that's what Caesar had in mind when he came back from civil war. To pretend that the old Republican game could still go on functioning as normal in the changed circumstances of their vast empire, especially now that its former players were mostly either dead or discredited, to pretend that it could still serve the needs of the whole, of the immense polity which depended on it for leadership. Was this not a recipe for more misery, civil war, strife, and depredations of the provinces and of Italy itself? And so, little by little, Caesar accepted supreme honors, royal honors, divine honors, when they were voted to him by his supporters, his flatterers, and the invidious among the Senate, who secretly wished to stoke up resentment of the remaining conservatives of Rome. It was these sorts of men, including some of his former supporters, men who had nothing of Caesar's political imagination, who murdered him on the Ides of March in 44 BC. As hindsight shows us, the sort of transition Caesar envisioned takes a long time, longer than Caesar had. The work was left to the long reign of his heir Augustus, but in fact it was largely Caesar's vision that Augustus went on to implement. You can already see the outlines of all the important pieces, pretty much, except for the Tribunicia Potestas. It's another conversation, but it's mostly all there. And this was a vision that I think Caesar probably expounded to Augustus or to the young Octavian himself when he came back from Africa. There was a sort of year and a half or so period of a tutelage that he had with the 16, 17-year-old Octavian. Maybe it was there that he sort of laid out the program for Augustus, though he didn't know he was going to have to implement it so soon. And it was left then to Augustus and his successors to stabilize the Roman peace on the model that Caesar had laid out, preserving the forms of the old republic over the later imperial centuries. They still have a senate, they still have consuls, they still have priests. There's a lot of stuff that's still sort of there. Preserving this in order to honor the memory of those who had built it and respect the dignity of the wealthy men who lent these antiquated forms valuable symbolic prestige, stabilizing the empire by their cooperative approval. This is already happening in the final year of Caesar's life. And so Rome traded that contentious and violent crucible of supreme excellence, the Republic, for unprecedented stability, for a flourishing of industry, as attested by the ancient ice deposits of Greenland, which bear the traces of vast Roman mining operations in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, and for a flourishing of the arts, powered by that industry. So much of the stone statuary and architecture that we recognize from antiquity derives from the period of the Pax Romana. And if they were not the highest arts anymore, at least they were high arts that were practiced, respectable arts. And it was left to the imagination of Constantine to re-envision this monarchy as a Christian empire, thereby setting down the model of an imperial polity based on respect for God and law, which then became the envy of Christian European and even Islamic rulers for millennia that followed. So I think for us today, Caesar can stand as a model for masterful generalship, the concern for the whole, the cultivation of practical wisdom and statesmanship. We'll brush aside the whole cuckolding of Roman senators issue. Don't imitate that. But above all, he stands as a supreme example of a capacious political imagination, a sense for what is possible for men of great talent at the head of a movement of great energy. People who can think past the political categories of their day and brush off the well-articulated complaints of the entrenched establishment, This is very hard to do for a politician, especially in a collective government where the opinions of such establishment figures clearly matter greatly, though not absolutely. And we need such examples, always, but especially now, and especially as Christians living temporarily in a beleaguered city of man, especially those of us who are going to enter the public service and take on those perennial worldly tasks of protecting the weak, defending the innocent from unscrupulous aggressors inside and out, rooting out corruption in the high places. To do these things well and effectively, we need that quintessential virtue of public life, articulated first by Aristotle, but later taken up by Christian theorists like Thomas Aquinas, namely greatness of soul, megalopsychia. This is positive ambition. It feeds on honor. But Aristotle himself points out that it is best directed, that craving for honor, at justly meriting the honor of those that we ourselves consider honorable. It is a virtue also cultivated by the heroic emotion of zeal, which Aristotle identified zelos as, defined it as the pain that we feel when we see others doing great things that spurs us on to emulate their excellence. And if we cannot find such people flourishing among our contemporaries, we can always look to merit the honor of the heroes who have gone before, or imagine their types looking upon us in the future. Whether through the grace of Christ there is somehow a viewing stand in heaven with room for men such as Julius Caesar to look down upon us, I prefer to let God decide. But even if he's in the other place, alongside other men to whom we owe so much, then perhaps he looks on us now, at least as in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And in that case, it might give him a small measure of relief to know that by remembering his name, we might spur ourselves on more energetically to do God's work. And this raises perhaps a fourth and final model for approaching Caesar and men like him, that even unknowingly, the supreme human specimen testifies to the power of his creator, in whose image he is made. Like the reverence the Athenians devoted to the altar of the unknown God, which Paul encountered at the Areopagus, the zeal and honor we pay to great figures outside the fold of the church, however imperfect or unsettling they might be, can ultimately accrue to the honor of the one true God. To study and learn from great specimens is not for most people. It is the business above all of those bent on greatness or charged with great responsibility. To acquire power and wield it to good effect, we must know how it works and learn from, and even imitate at times, the strengths of the amoral tiger burning bright, the cunning slyness of the fox. For our enemies will certainly do so. We should put our trust in God above all. That also means making use of all the tools that he has provided us with, some of them frightful ones, which he himself has once mysteriously wrought to his own service. Thank you.